So I'm going to talk about design system APIs and the developer experience. Just a quick intro on me. I'm design operations manager at GitHub, but for most of the time that I've worked there for the last 3 years, I have been managing the design systems team. The design operations team doesn't actually have any employees yet. The first employee will be starting next month. But design operations encompasses design systems, our hiring and onboarding processes, how we work together, and will soon also include design research. And probably the key takeaway there is I'm a manager. This year our team went from, I had two people I was managing to 7. And so I write less and less code. I spend more time in Markdown docs. So one good thing about working at GitHub is that we write a lot of Markdown instead of, we get to use all the same tools instead of using maybe things like Google Docs and stuff. So at least I can feel cool, like committing and pushing up my Markdown changes. I'm broccolini on the internet. It's a better version of broccoli, basically. Not really that exciting story. And I'm not sure if you just said that I was German, but I'm actually from the UK. But if you're just getting a bit confused about my accent, I lived in Australia for about 8 years, and some of the accent kind of stuck. And I've been living in the United States for about 7 years. So lots of people like to tell me my accent is a bit of a hodgepodge or a messy kind of accent, but I like to think of it as an eclectic mix. So there. Okay, so design systems at GitHub. So I formed the team about 3 years ago, but design systems wasn't like brand new to GitHub. They had kept sort of versions of style guides and shared styles and assets from pretty early on. And so when I started at GitHub, I wasn't completely starting from scratch. Primer, which is the name of our design system, was open sourced in 2015, just before I started, but it had been used for a few years internally. GitHub is 10 years old, and so that also means 10 years of hundreds of people contributing design and code. So as some people have mentioned today, that creates some challenges, some code debt. I don't maybe have to deal with some of the scale issues that Adobe has to, but it's a lot sometimes. It's also a Ruby on Rails monolith, not monorepo, monolith. So all the code for github.com is in one repo, or most of it anyway, which is also kind of fun. And so when we started off the design systems team, we couldn't just be like, hey, everyone, can you just pause for a second on what you're doing while we go off and build this better version of Primer and then carry on? We had to build it, update it, and introduce real systems while the train was still moving. So you might be thinking, oh, Ruby on Rails, that's like 10, 12 years ago or something. It's 2018. Everyone's been talking about React. So I am also going to talk not just about Primer CSS, which is what's used currently or in the majority of cases on github.com and the Rails monolith, but also Primer components, which we've been working on this year, which is our React component library. So I wanted to start off talking about API design. I think maybe a few people have used this expression. API is Application Programming Interface. Really, it's a very important part of your design system. It's the thing that developers interact with. It's your class naming conventions. It's the names of your components. It's your props and prop types. It's kind of acts as like a contract between your developers and the design system about how this works. How does this design system work? And because of this, I think the design of your design system API is really important to the developer experience. If your API is confusing or complex or frustrating to use, there's only kind of like so much you can do for the developer experience. So I want to start off talking about some of the things I learned from working with Primer CSS about API design and developer experience before I move on to React components. So some of the things that we can do with CSS is we can have naming conventions, consistent naming conventions that start to tell the developer what these things mean and what they do. We can enforce or suggest like a HTML structure. So for us, we wanted to do things like keeping the specificity low at the class level and applying classes to elements rather than having like many styles like cascading down from the parent. And we wanted to have predictable patterns. And so our markup looks something like this. So you've got some BEM syntax components in there. And of course, like everyone, we wanted to do our own special flavor of BEM, which then results in 2.5 days of bike shedding discussions in design systems about should we do Pascal case or camel case? We don't like underscores, so we'll do this instead. And so, so you can look at this. Once you've learned this, you can see that, oh, boxes is part of a component. And then we also have utilities. So something like F3 Lite is one of our single-purpose utility classes or atomic classes, functional CSS, lots of different names for the same thing. So what's the developer experience look like when we're just only really sort of controlling this with CSS? So we did semantic versioning. Luckily, that was introduced from pretty early on, so I didn't have to deal with some of the problems that Sarah was just talking about. So that's really important because it tells developers at the sort of getting started phase, like if they are starting a new project, what version that it's got some history, or if they're making some updates, have there been any like breaking changes? Release notes obviously back that stuff up and change logs, giving the details about what's changed. Deprecation warnings. We always do deprecation warnings for stuff we plan to remove from Primer before we actually remove it in a major release. And of course, documentation. Everyone's talked about documentation. We know that's important. And that like really helps a developer before they start get a picture of what it's going to be like to work with this design system. For local development, we did a couple of things. There's a lot of Atom fans at GitHub, unsurprisingly. So we made some Atom plugins that did things like autocomplete the class selectors so that people had to type less. And we had, obviously, linters, we'll talk about a bit today. So being able to run linters locally, also having Atom plugins so that you actually see where you might be kind of straying off the path in local development. Also, our web systems team, who we work pretty closely with, built an accessibility error scanner that you could run in your local development environment. That's really helpful. That lets people like catch problems, do the right thing early on in the development process. And then once you get to code review, we use continuous integration checks to tell people if their code's up to standards, if it's passed all those linters. And lots of people have talked about bots, and we like bots too. And we have some bots that comment on PRs and tell people if they could have used like a SAS variable instead of a static value, or things like that. Our team actually reviews every single pull request that includes SAS changes. So having bots help us with the repetitive, easy to catch things is really, really helpful. So what did we do for the design experience? Well, people no longer had to write quite as much CSS. We made styles that were flexible and reusable. We had a lot more coverage of patterns that were commonly used. So that really helped. And that makes it easier for designers or developers to design in the browser, because they can not have to worry as much about writing CSS every time they want to try something out or tweak a layout. They can just change the markup. And that's really nice for, I think, designers in particular. With design tools, they get direct manipulation, whereas when they're editing code, there's a bit of a space between making that change and then seeing that change. So the more we can do to kind of like reduce that feedback loop, the better. So by not having to write new CSS and being able to just write markup, like closes that feedback loop a little bit more. But we still have lots of problems with this design system and with building UI at GitHub. One, there's lots and lots of repeated chunks of markup. So we can make things flexible in our CSS, but we still got tons and tons of repeated markup, and that makes things a little bit painful and a little bit hard to maintain. We also, because we, as I've mentioned, weren't starting from scratch, there is a ton of cases in the code base where people are overriding primer styles. And so that's really bad, because that means we can't be as confident that when we make changes to our design system, it's changing it in the way that we want to everywhere. And that makes making updates difficult. And this is all because, CSS is kind of leaky, right? It kind of can flow on into lots of things. Inheritance is great. Inheritance school, love it, love it. But lots of people don't really know how the cascade works very well. And they're not really going to learn it if they're not someone like us that are passionate about that and it's part of their daily work. So that's difficult, and that can create, all that leakiness can create some difficult messes to untangle. Oh no. Oh, it's okay on that slide. On my slide, the unhappy face is split on 2 lines and looks really bad. Okay, cool. Phew. That makes for not, all of that stuff, kind of makes for not such a great developer experience. That does cause some frustrations. So for those reasons and other reasons, 2018 became the year of React for us. Because of these problems and wanting to be able to componentize our front end and not have to repeat the same markup everywhere, but also because of more teams using React. For example, the GitHub Actions team used React to build their UI, and also used a very early version of our Primer component library, which is really great. So more and more teams started to use React at GitHub, and that kind of tipped the scales for us and gave us the kind of thumbs up to start exploring React to build components. Oh, and so quick, by the way, it's actually open source now. We have been publishing the documentation and the NPM packages since the beginning, but we've now also made the actual source code open source. We haven't been shouting about it because it's still in beta, lots of problems, but we'd love you to check it out, give us feedback, see what you think. And I'll highlight some of the problems as we go on to the next couple of slides. So how did we go about building this Primer component library? One of the main goals and things that I made a priority at the beginning is to prioritize the public API. Prioritize the interface that developers are going to interact with. Let's figure out how to get that right and not worry too much about the mess behind the scenes. Maybe worry about it a little bit, but not too much. As Sid said earlier today, one of the nice things about React is that you don't have to worry about how the classes and styles and stuff are being applied. You're sort of just dealing with the component. And so that's why we focused on that public API at first. So we did something really simple to start with. We used a library called class names and used our existing Primer classes and applied those to React components. And that allowed us to start to explore what the API could look like. It also showed us some things that we weren't really happy about with the state of our CSS as well. GitHub has, certainly on the product team and the design team, has this kind of philosophy of incremental correctness. And so for our team, it was really important to make progress rather than being making the design system that we really wanted and saw in the future not the most correct thing or the most ideal thing. So we kind of came up with our own principle that progress was better than correctness. We kind of knew that we probably wanted to explore using CSS and JS libraries and things like that. But in the early stages, it was more important to try and develop the public API than play with all the kind of new shiny tools. Like many people have talked about here and many teams have to deal with, we have this, we need flexibility, but we also need brand consistency. Primer needs to support not just github.com, but like a huge amount of other websites. We have a lot of marketing sites, and we have like developer sites, and then we do one-off things like Open Source Friday and things like that. And ideally, we want them all to use Primer, and more of them are or already have. Some of them are on terribly old versions, unfortunately. But because of this, we need things to be kind of a bit flexible when it comes to the marketing side of things. My colleague, Sophie Shepherd, who works on the web design team, came up with this really great way of thinking about it, which is brand on a spectrum. So when we're looking at github.com, there's really not much flexibility in terms of the representation of the brand. It needs to look like GitHub. It needs to use our colors. It needs to use our typography. It kind of needs to use our design system out of the box. And that's definitely where our priorities lie with this design system. As you get further away from the product environment and you're looking at something like a conference website, that's where we have a bit more fun. That's where we're a bit more expressive and creative. That's where we might use completely different colors and typography and imagery and things like that. And so our design system needs to support both these things. And I noticed that one of the principles that I really stuck with and influenced how I approach CSS architecture also made sense for working with React components. And that's to separate structure and skin, which is from the object-oriented CSS wiki or guidelines that Nicole Sullivan developed. And so that's about like, let me put some examples up. So layout, for example, that doesn't want to worry about the skin of things. It's about the padding and spacing, and it's the structure of your application. And we found that most of any site that we want to build, whether it's a marketing site or github.com, it's going to need layout, styles, and components. It's going to need that. And then most product sites are going to need certain components like alerts, buttons, labels. Maybe marketing sites won't need things like alerts, but they're probably going to need buttons. And then underlying that, there's this theme of typography scale, spacing, color. And all the components and the layout styles, they use that underlying theme. And ideally, you want to be able to change that. The theme is the thing that might change. So when you're working on your marketing site, that's the thing that you might want to swap out. And ideally, have something where you kind of have like the same component markup, but swap out what's behind it. And so that's one of the things that we started talking about and thinking that we wanted to do with this component library. We want developers and designers to be able to switch between any one of our GitHub websites and be familiar with the code base and be familiar with how to implement the UI. And so that's what we try to approach with our React component library. One of the things that we ended up exploring to help with this was system props, which we built with Style System and Emotion.js. We started to struggle with achieving that kind of flexibility with our theme, with just applying the Primer CSS class names. And so we turned to a CSS and JS approach. So we have a theme.js file. We may end up exploring things like tokens and stuff in the future, but at the moment we have all our sort of like core themes like font sizes, line height, colors, our spacing scale, all those sorts of things. They're all in JSON objects, and then in our component library we have this theme.js file that lists all those things out. And then we found that we started to notice patterns where we wanted to share certain system props across many different components. We started off being a little bit too restrictive, and then we started to notice patterns, and we came up with this. We basically give every component color and space. On the few occasions where someone might do something not so great with that, it's not worth it. It's just, there's so many more times where you just really want to apply a background color or apply margin and padding to something. We decided to give every single component that system prop. And then for text, for typography components, we give all of them font family, font size, font weight, line height. For layout components, they get display, size, width, height. And then for position, gets position, Z index, top right, bottom left, all that's sort of fun. And that way, we start to create these patterns. So every type of typography component, so something like not just a text or a heading, but maybe a label, they get all of those system props. And one of the things that's nice about that is it makes it really easy for people to make new components out of the primer components in their own code base. So GitHub Actions, for example, has a bunch of components that don't really make sense to live in the primer design system. They're like very custom to that thing, but they can make a new component out of system props and our existing components without writing new styles and things. So that's really nice. That's a really nice kind of composable experience. It's also important to, one of the other things that's nice about system props is reusing those patterns. So if someone uses system props on one component and they go to another component that has them, they know how they work. They learn that really quickly. And then we also do something similar for what we call scheme props, which are our component-specific props. So sometimes we have something like, say, an alert message, and we use like a white foreground with a green background or something like that. And that becomes a scheme. And once a developer learns what the scheme prop does in one component, even though the values change, they get the gist of what that does somewhere else. And this leads me to talking about minimal API surface area, which is a really fantastic talk if you haven't seen it by Sebastian Markbedge. I've watched this twice. I plan to watch it many more times, and tell your teams to watch it if they haven't. It has so much useful information that doesn't just apply to design systems, but just generally in development. And so what he talked about was having a small surface area, the most minimal surface area you can for your API. And this really translates, I think, to design systems. We know that people don't always read documentation. We know that people cut and paste. And we want people to learn by using. So reusing those patterns and making that API minimal is really, really important. This is kind of turning into my principle of the principles we developed for our team. Watch out for the apocalypse. Oh, yes, they're so hard to say. Sometimes I mess it up. Girl Code talked about this. It's really easy to, it's really hard actually. I was gonna say, it's really easy to add like tons and tons of props to one component because you're like, oh, that's convenient. Oh, I needed this in this one situation. So yeah, I need to add all of that. This is actually what our layout props initially looked like. So we had like borders and border color in there. We also had all our position stuff in there. And I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay, I think we need to like rethink this. Because we're making that API more complex. And so most of the time, we weren't using borders on a box component or something like that. So that should be another component. So it's a trade-off. It's difficult to get right sometimes. It's a balance between like the complexity of a single component API and the composability. I don't have a silver bullet for the answer on how to make those decisions. It's just have discussions with your team, figure out where the right balance is. Another principle we have is that everything is a component, which is stolen from thinking in React. Some developers sort of questions like, why can't I just use like an H1 tag? Why is it better to use like the heading component? And that's because, going back to this, we're trying to keep all the styles like encapsulated in that component. We can't really do that if it doesn't exist in the component. We can't make those updates. We can't control like how styles are being applied to that H1. We don't want to rely on inheritance in that way. We want things to be kind of all kept inside that component. So that's why everything's a component for us. Of course, this is kind of like introducing constraints. And we need to be careful with that because too many constraints can kind of reduce that developer experience. They make it more reliable, and so we heavily suggest that. But you know, if a developer wants to use a H1 tag, they can. But we're going to demonstrate kind of like best practice and make that suggestion, have it in our principles, write our code in that way in all the sites that we build that way. Something that we found really helpful is to design the public API before you actually build it. This is basically README-driven development. It's really hard to have a conversation around API that's looking at like all the internals without sort of getting a feel for like how does this work? What is this component like to use for the developer? This kind of came out of a weekly team review that we started having to make sure our team was all heading in the right direction. I think I've forgotten who talked about this earlier, sorry, but someone was talking about making sure your team know your process. I think it's also important when you're doing something like developing a new part of your system. Make sure you're all in line with your principles. You're probably going to develop your principles and change them and iterate on them as you go. So having regular in-person check-ins to discuss that, to make sure you're heading in a direction and learning where you need to make changes is really, really important. We also did a lot of dog feeding and testing on our own to sort of use our own design system so that we're making sure that it did feel like a good experience. We, as well as testing with GitHub Actions, we also, when we built our new Primer website, we built it, of course, with our new component library. And we also were exploring the dark theme with that, so that was really great because that enabled us to help test those how easy it was to theme and compose with. And we learned a ton from that. We also did the same for our Primer components docs. And yeah, I definitely think that this is a really good thing to do, is test the thing yourself before you sort of just lop it over to other people to test and find those pain points. Before I wrap up, I want to talk quickly about the private API. So by that I mean how the actual component's built, what's happening behind the scenes. I think that we have to remind ourselves that each library, function, script, abstraction that we use is another thing that someone has to learn if they want to actually contribute to your design system. And so the quality of the private API is really important for the contribution experience. Another a quote from Sandy Metz, duplication is far cheaper than the wrong abstraction. It's really tempting to dry up code, and that is important for other reasons, especially with scale. But in the early stages of design systems, it can really mean you shoot yourself in the foot. It can cause more problems than solving problems. So be careful about when you make abstractions. So overall, there's lots of things that we can do for the contribution experience. Some people have talked about that today. Contribution guidelines, really, really helpful, and they stand out in a special way when you open a PR in GitHub, which is really nice. Consistent code style, one of the reasons why we haven't shouted about our new component library is because it's not really that consistent yet. We have made a big mess in that private API, so we've got some tidying up to do. But demonstrating so that using that consistent code style yourselves so that when developers come to contribute, they can learn by example. Easy to run dev environment. It's nice if you can just pull stuff down, npm install, npm start, boom, you're running. Having things like, we're lucky in React land with things like hot reloading and stuff like that makes it really, really nice. Feedback errors, also awesome. Automatic deploys is something that we started to do on most of our code bases, so that when anyone pushes up a PR, it deploys it for them so they immediately can share a link and check that everything worked how it worked in their local dev environment. And importantly, a timely response for maintainers. That's definitely challenging sometimes. We struggled with that. So whether it's open source or not, responding and getting back to people quickly is really important because they might otherwise give up and be like, oh, I don't care, I'm not going to try and use this, or I'm not going to try and fix this thing. I think for developers, having a great contribution experience can really mean a great development experience. If someone like successfully contributes and fixes something, it means they've understood your principles, they've learned your code style, they understand your API, and they valued using it so much that they're willing to like help make your design system better. So it's worth spending some time on that private API and that contribution experience too. So almost at the end, almost at party time, drinking time. What's next for Primer components and GitHub? So I want to say we don't know exactly whether we will use React moving forward in github.com. I think there's like a pretty strong chance we will. It's certainly being used by many teams, but we're not sure yet. If anyone's tried like using React with Rails, is like a little bit fun. We've had some fun experiments trying that out. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we've built this component library and it's only used by a few of our apps. We've learned a ton from that experience. And I think it's really easy to get attracted by the new shiny things, and I am definitely guilty of that too. But whether we're working with CSS and Rails or React or Vue or Ember or Angular, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. It's like we all have like the same intent. We want to make a great design system that has a great developer experience, that is efficient, that makes our colleagues' lives better. It's just a different implementation. And so progress is, I just want to remind you that progress is better than correctness. It's better to keep making decisions, keep moving forward. Don't worry about what everyone else is doing. Just focus on what's right for you and your company. Thank you.